I'd like to welcome you back to another installment of one of our Rare Book Room lectures. We're here on the campus of Reformation Bible College in the library, and just over there is our Rare Book Room. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of really one of my favorite lines from Dr. Sproul's book, The Holiness of God. He's the subject of our lecture tonight, and you can't talk about R.C. without talking about the holiness of God. And there's a line, it comes way at the end of the book, and R.C. writes, "Each of our lives is marked by sacred sites that we cherish in our memories." And I just think that's a beautiful line. And this place, this campus, has become a sacred site for me that is cherished in my memory, and hopefully for many memories to come. And an important part of that, an important part of this place is this library. And an important part of that is the Rare Book Room. In the Rare Book Room, we have some wonderful collections. It was just a little bit of time ago that we had Reverend Kane here, and we discussed the Kane collection. At one time, we had Derek Thomas here, and we discussed our Pilgrim's Progress and Bunyan collection we have. But we have the R.C. Sproul Collection here. And it's fitting, because this is the college that R.C. founded. Now, we'll talk about a number of the items in the Sproul Collection, because we have his books, his library that he used, and I'll talk about that a little bit tonight. But we also have his personal notebooks and just some personal items that belong to R.C. that I want to share with you. Really, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what's back there. But sort of a fun book to just get us started is this. It's the Book of Common Worship from the Presbyterian Church, and it showed up in my office, and then a couple days later I saw Vesta, R.C.'s beloved wife and widow now, and she asked me if I got the book that she left for me. And I said, yeah, I think so. I said, was this the book that was, a little bit worn on the cover? And she said, you mean the book that looked like a dog chewed it? And I said, yeah, the book that looks like a dog chewed it. And she said, well, that's because a dog did chew it. So this is a book of R.C.'s that one of his beloved German shepherds, who will remain nameless for the sake of this teaching video, we'll keep the dog nameless, but there you go, a dog chewed book of common worship. Well, I remember reading about R.C. defined as an American-born theologian. And it was Dr. Sproul who said, it is the theologian's prerogative to make distinctions. So I'd like to go back into that description and make a few distinctions. Because there is first and foremost, to understand R.C., a distinction of American-born is to understand that R.C. was Pittsburgh-born. So we start there. He was a Pittsburgh-born theologian. And when I wrote the biography, I knew the first chapter had to be Pittsburgh. Now, part of the reason for that is this manuscript that not only did R.C. write in his own hand, but he loved it so much, he decided he would sign it. So I have this great on his very typical yellow legal pad with his very legible cursive, but he writes up at the top, you, and this is funny to me, he started to write you may, but he crossed out may and wrote can. Because not only is his cursive legible, but his grammar is correct. So he writes, you can take the man out of Pittsburgh, but you cannot take Pittsburgh out of the man. My roots are in Pittsburgh. And to this day, I love every tree, every blade of grass, and every pothole in the burg. Now, you have to be from Pittsburgh to appreciate that comment about potholes. But there was something about him being a Pittsburgh-born, and then it says American-born theologian. Well, let me make a distinction there too. Because among theologians, R.C. would want us to say he was a Reformed theologian. So he's not an American-born theologian If we make distinctions, he's a Pittsburgh-born Reformed theologian. Now, you can say Reformed means a lot of things. Obviously, it means a particular approach to the doctrines of grace. So we talk about the beloved flower of the Netherlands and the tulip. But it's interesting, even if you go to the tulip, which we have made as an English construction of a very important document in the post-Reformation era, early post-Reformation era of the 1610s, and that's the Canons of Dort. There were 5 heads to the Canons of Dort. So far, so good, because there's 5 letters in the tulip. But the Canons of Dort were not actually in that order of tulip. They didn't start with total depravity. They didn't start with man. Dort actually is Ultip, if we were to use the letters of the tulip, which tells us what, right? It starts with God. It's the unconditional election. Then it moves to Christ's work, and then it moves to us. That is a very Reformed instinct. To be Reformed ultimately means we always start with God. It's the doctrine of God that is at the essence and center of the distinction of being Reformed, and for R.C., being a Reformed theologian. And then he would say that not only do we have this doctrine of God, but here's what differentiates the Reformed from Roman Catholicism, is that as we move from page 1 of our doctrine to page 2 of our doctrine and page 3 of our doctrine, we carry that doctrine of God consistently with us. And that's what differentiates the Reformed from Catholicism, and even the Reformed from other branches within Protestantism or within broader evangelicalism. Now, to see how central this idea of the holiness of God, it really was the central idea for R.C. And he would say it was both central and essential. Well, to sort of trace the roots of this, I want to go back to his bachelor's thesis. So this is the original copy, and I love it because it's got the Westminster College from New Wilmington, PA. So this is about an hour's drive north of Pittsburgh, college he went to. Historically Presbyterian, but liberal, and had the one professor there who was sort of a lifeline for him, Professor Gregory. He was a philosopher, but he was Westminster Seminary trained, so he taught religion classes from time to time. Well, Dr. Sproul talked Professor Gregory into letting him write his bachelor's thesis on Melville, and he wrote it in 1961. It says on here, I don't know if you can pick this up, but it says, paper by Bob Sproul. So R.C. Sproul has yet to emerge, right? We're still Bob Sproul at this point, or Robert Sproul. If you were a friend of his, you would have called him Sonny. He was Sonny Sproul to everyone else. Well, the thesis, this bachelor's thesis, is entitled The Existential Implications of Melville's Moby Dick. So the first thing I can say is, this guy's probably going to go on to be a professor, right? If he's writing this as a college senior. And he's talking about Captain Ahab. And he's talking about how, of course, there's an allusion there to Ahab of the Old Testament. Obvious, intentional on Melville's part. And he's talking about how Ahab sort of circumscribes the whale, and he charts the whale, and he thinks by doing that he can control the whale. And of course this becomes Ahab's downfall, because this white whale is so majestic, so transcendent, right? And this is a metaphor for God. In fact, R.C. will go on to say that chapter, The Whiteness of the Whale, is the most beautiful chapter, not only in American literature, but in all of literature. Well, here he is, young college senior, and he writes this, that what Melville is presenting through this character Ahab, it seems to be an attack upon the shallow religious views of mankind. And when I saw that line, as I was reading through his thesis, I thought, There it is. There's the germ of R.C.'s concern that whether you're in the church or in culture, you don't know who God is. That our fundamental problem is that we have a shallow religious view. And we've sort of been anesthetized by culture or just by the assurance, we go back to the 1960s. We're on the heels of the 1950s. This is the Leave It to Beaver generation. We're all God-fearing Christian Americans. And we've sort of gotten into this phase that R.C. is seeing of how this has crept into churches, which historically had been confessional and convictional, had long ago abandoned those confessions and convictions and not presenting who God is. And the result of that is many people were anesthetized to their true condition because they weren't looking at themselves against the true litmus test they should have been looking at, which is the holiness of God. I mean, compared to each other, right? We can say, well, we look pretty good. We can pick out a certain group and say, we're fine. But that's not the comparison. And so when I found that line in 1961, I thought, this is great. This is really the thread that is going to be pulled, that is going to be at the center of R.C. as a Reformed theologian. Now, if we fast forward to 1970, he teaches that he's invited to Saranac Lake in New York, and he gives a lecture series there to young life staff on the topic of the holiness of God. And in the audience was Dora Hillman, and she's a very wealthy widow, lived just outside of Pittsburgh in the Ligonier Valley. The Ligonier Valley was sometimes seen as sort of the playground for the wealthy of Pittsburgh. And so she went to R.C. after he presented these lectures, and she said, if you could do anything you wanted to do, what would it be? And he said, start a study center. And she had the means, and a 52-acre farm went up for sale near her farm, and she bought it. And next thing you know, 1971 is the study center. Then 1975, the teaching series that R.C. records is The Holiness of God. And then 1985, the book. Now, what's fascinating is he had been thinking through this idea, remember back in 1961, but he'd been thinking through this all through the 60s and 70s. And one of the delightful things we have in our Rare Book Room collection is the library of Dr. Sproul. And so we can go back and sort of trace his steps through the books that he read and the books that influenced him. And one of those books is by this German theologian, Rudolph Otto, The Idea of the Holy, published in German and translated into English. Well, Dr. Sproul devotes a whole chapter to the idea that he got from Otto in this book. The chapter is chapter 4 of The Holiness of God, and he calls it the fearful mystery. Now, I loved that R.C. was an active writer. So he liked to underline. There's often this squiggly line in the side. And I asked him one time what that meant, and he said, oh, that's a quote I wanted to pay attention to and maybe use sometime. So he'd write a squiggly line. At one point, he's adding his sort of emphasis of what he just learned from this chapter, and there it is, sanctus, right? Holy. And then numinous, this is the idea of the holy that Otto presents in this book. But then Otto turns to what he calls the fearful mystery, or the Latin expression of the mysterium tremendum. Now, mysterium comes into English pretty nicely, right? Mysterium, mystery. What do you think tremendum comes into the English as? Can you guess an English word? Tremendous. Now that was totally unfair of me because I totally set you up. But we think tremendous. That's not the right word. Here's the actual English word. Tremor. To shake. To shake before the holy God. Now certainly God is tremendous in his holiness. But the Latin expression is the mystery that makes us shake. Now, as R.C., and he quotes Otto extensively in chapter 4, there it is, the big block quote of Otto's discussion of the fearful mystery. And then R.C. says this, Otto spoke of the tremendum awfulness, as in full of awe, the awfulness because of the fear the holy provokes in us. The holy fills us with a kind of dread. We use expressions like, my blood ran icy cold, or my flesh crept. We think of the Negro spiritual. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? The refrain of the song says, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. So we can have this library and not only appreciate the result of the study, but we can go back in and retrace the steps and see the study. Well, I talked about R.C. as Pittsburgh born, and talked about theologian, but we made the distinction that he's a Reformed theologian. We can go back in now to theologian. Now, I know what you're all thinking, because you're thinking, aha, everyone's a theologian, right? So that would be the description for all of us. We'd all be described as theologians. Well, that's true. And while he said that, he also made the point that there is a professional or a vocational theologian who particularly and especially in a scholarly way pursues the study of God. And I found this piece, which I think is just delightful. And again, it's the cursive on the yellow paper, and it is entitled, My Career Path and Vocation. And he says, variously, I have been labeled according to different descriptions. Most frequently, the appellations included are the following three: theologian, communicator, apologist. Then he says, I would like to pursue the definitions of these three. So he goes on to talk about a theologian. And see how he is underlined there? Theologian. And he says a theologian is basically someone who pursues the scholarly study of religion, which is the scholarly study of God. And he talks about systematic theology and historical theology and biblical theology and practical theology. And these are all the domains of the theologian. And he walks through that. And then he defines each one. So he starts with systematic theology. And he says, when he gets through all this, primarily I'm a systematic theologian, but I draw from all these others in my work. Then he gets to number 2, and he writes communicator, and then he stops, and he just leaves it blank. And I remember the first time I saw this, I thought, oh no. And then he never went back to it. The unfinished manuscript of R.C. Sproul. So what I want to do is sort of take it upon myself to finish that for him and work from some of his material to see how this was what he was. He wasn't just a theologian. And we can pause here and say, and this is what I was trying to do in the biography. This was a big piece of what I was trying to do in the biography. We only see, for a lot of people, they only see the finished product. They know the R.C. Sproul of the books, which are riveting. They know the R.C. Sproul of the conference speaker, and he was the only one who could talk to a crowd of thousands, look across the lectern, and you thought you were talking to your best friend. Or you know him through the radio. And you turn on the radio, and every single other preacher on the radio was someone preaching a sermon. And then all of a sudden, you turn the radio, and you start hearing, what is that? Wait, that's chalk in the background. This guy's writing with chalk on a chalkboard, and he's talking about Aristotle, and tomorrow there's going to be a lesson on the Greek philosophers after Aristotle. So he was doing something very different than a lot of people. But however you came to RC, you saw the finished product. what I think we need to come to grips with is that just didn't come de novo, right? Just out of the blue and just pop into existence. There was work that went behind what we saw. There was that decade, as he finished up after he's converted at college and finishes off the 50s. But there's that whole decade of the 60s of where he's just dedicating himself as a student. So I want to pull some of that out. So first is this book. And this book was so worn that he wore the cover off of it. And then what he tried to do, which really was not very effective, but he tried to tape the spine label on with Scotch tape, but it didn't quite work. But if you had the spine label, it would tell you that this is the Canons and Decrees of the Council of Trent. Now, what's interesting about this book is the first half is, Trent, of course, is the Catholic's response to the Protestant Reformation. So we're 16th century now, and we're in the Catholic world of responding to the Reformation at the Council of Trent. Now, the first half of this book is in English, translation of the canons that were handed down from Trent. The second half is Latin. When Dr. Sproul got to seminary at Pittsburgh Seminary, which was a liberal seminary, but he had there too a lifeline, and it was John Gershner. And there were a handful of students that Gershner would from time to time do what amounted to an independent study with. And one of those semesters, Dr. Sproul and just 2 or 3 other students spent a whole semester going through the canons of Trent, just working with the primary sources. And this was the textbook. And what I love about this is he's very active. And so I love this. It's the Trent, and in the margin he writes, "No." And it's caps and an exclamation point. No. He was an active reader. And every once in a while you see a little doodle too. But down here he writes Gershner. So this was a particular note that Gershner made. And so you can see him, right, in class. So, later he's going to be involved in evangelicals and Catholics together. And he's going to talk about the doctrine of justification. He's going to write his book on getting the gospel right. He's going to write in the 2010s his book, Are We Together? Roman Catholicism. And so what you have to see is behind that, he was a serious student of Roman Catholic theology. So as a theologian, as a Reformed theologian, not just going after straw men, but making real arguments against the real view of Roman Catholicism. And when you work through this book, and you just see page after page of notes and underlines, you see R.C. the student. Well, after he finishes seminary, he goes to Amsterdam. And I think I have time to tell this story real quick. But he met with Gershner, and Gershner was convinced that R.C. should go do doctoral studies. So he said to Gershner, well, if I'm going to spend my time and money investing in doctoral studies, I want to study under the best. Who's the best? Who should I study under? And Gershner said, Gerrit C. Berkouwer at the Free University of Amsterdam. And then Dr. Sproul said, no, you misunderstood me. I said, who's the best English-speaking theologian that I should go study under? And Gershner said, Gerrit C. Berkouwer, Free University of Amsterdam. R.C. goes and buys a ticket on a ship for Vesta, for their daughter Sherry, and for R.C., and off they go to Amsterdam to study under Berkouwer. He gets there, has his first meeting with Berkouwer. Berkouwer slides him a list of about 40 books that R.C. needs to read and study for his first exam that he needs to take with Berkouwer. And a number of them are Latin texts, and then a number of them are Dutch texts, and then there's a few French texts and a few German texts. Well, he slides this list to R.C., and R.C.'s, scrolling up and down this list of books. Berkouwer could see the expression that had washed over R.C.'s face. And he asked R.C., what's the matter? And R.C. said, well, I don't read French very well. Didn't have the heart to tell him, neither can I read German, neither can I read Dutch, and I really can't read Latin that much either. But Berkouwer said, oh, that's fine. Crosses out the French books, adds 5 more Dutch ones, and turns it back to R.C. Well, this was Berkouwer's own book on the person of Christ. Now, if Dr. Sproul had just waited to the 1970s, there would have been an English translation. And I have the English translation on my shelf, but he didn't have that luxury. And so this is the first page. And he's got certain Dutch words circled and underlined. What he did was he got a set of index cards. And he would write the Dutch word on the index card, look it up in a Dutch English dictionary, find the English definition, flip it over on the index card, write the English, so he could make his own vocabulary cards. Then he went to the second word, and then the third word. And then he had to consult a grammar to see the verb endings and the noun declensions. I remember seeing this first time when I saw this book and talked to Dr. Sproul about it, and I saw that in the bottom was 12 hours. So I said, Dr. Sproul, what's the 12 hours? And so he said, that's how long it took to do that page. Right? So this is his first Dutch book without knowing Dutch, and you jump into scholarly book to try to learn the language. So here's the picture of Dr. Sproul as a student in Amsterdam. Feet under the desk, pen and paper, book, dictionary, index cards, slogging through it, right? So what we're seeing here is the foundation of study, of being a student who is rigorously pursuing the study of God. Now, while he was in Amsterdam, he kept all these notebooks, and we know that this one was bought there, dictaten, right? So he had these notebooks, and these were notebooks from his reading, and he would just take literally copious notes of the textbooks that he was reading. We've got stacks of these notebooks of Dr. Sproul's that give outlines and notes on books. And every once in a while, we even get a spiral bound one. And for a while, apparently he was enjoying some green ink. So I don't know. Maybe there was a sale on green ink pens, but there we have it. So this was Dr. Sproul as the student. And of course, in addition to all those theology books, he was a student of the Bible. So this is his old Thompson Chain Reference Bible. And it was a gift from Vesta's parents to R.C. Now, he got it rebound, and I love this little note in here. When he went to Cincinnati, just before he went to the study center, he went to Cincinnati and served as a pastor. And he taught a class on Romans, and it says rebound by your Roman class. So a little typo there. I'm sure R.C. appreciated that. But speaking of Roman, let's go to Romans and see. Oh, yes. Okay. So we know we're in Romans because it is a tattered mess. And it is taped and retaped and underlined and notes. And I mean, you know, you think of Uzzah, you go to the text of Uzzah, there it is, underlined notes. You go to Isaiah 6, there it is, underlined notes. So this was his Bible that he studied from for a decade or two before it finally just wore out and needed to be set aside and replaced. But what we see here in the Sproul Collection is, again, the foundation that goes into what we later see. And I'll just pause to give a little, and the moral of the story is, right? So this is the challenge for those who want to go into ministry, those who want to be faithful in the teaching and preaching of God's Word. And they see someone like an R.C. Sproul, and they think you just, get zapped by a wand and you stand up and do that. And the reality is grace of God, power of the Holy Spirit, work. That's the formula. And it's legs, feet under the desk, books open, notebook open, and study. And God honored that in R.C.'s life. Well, he was a theologian that first of all meant he was a student. But then he became a teacher. And I think this is what he's going to talk about as a communicator. That ultimately a teacher must be clear. Ultimately a teacher must be winsome and persuasive. A true communicator. Not just knowing truth. There are plenty of people, in the academic world we call them eggheads. There are plenty of people who know so much. They know more than they will ever possibly need to know, but they have difficulty conveying that knowledge to other people. And maybe even more difficulty imparting that knowledge to other people. So a true teacher is one who not only has a head full of knowledge, but is able to impart it. And you can even go a step further, able to impart it in a way that people get it. Like they truly get it and they get excited about it. Well, one of my favorite things in this, and I trot it out at the beginning of every semester for myself before I teach, is an early syllabus of Dr. Sproul's. He taught for a year at his alma mater, Westminster College. Then he taught for a couple years at Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts. Then he taught at Conwell Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, which was on the campus of Temple before Conwell merged with Gordon and became Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And after he taught at Conwell, he went to Cincinnati for that brief pastorate, then 71. 50 years ago, it's 2021 right now, 50 years ago, started the study center. But this is from 67. He has moved up from Robert Sproul to Professor Robert Sproul, but R.C. has yet to emerge, right? This is, of course, Contemporary Theology, fall term 1967. It's got the typical things a syllabus would have. There's the lecture outline with the dates. The assignments are in here. But there's a few paragraphs that aren't in your typical syllabus. I want to read them to you because I think they give us insight into the kind of teacher R.C. was, and that he was a communicator. So the type is fading here, so I'll do my best to try to read it. But he says, final note, classroom procedure. I enjoy a casual and informal atmosphere in the classroom. Well, surprise, surprise, right? None of us would have guessed that R.C. liked a casual, I'm joking, of course. You can totally picture him as the most popular professor on campus, right? With his dynamic, winsome personality. He enjoyed a casual, informal atmosphere in the classroom. Freewheeling debate and questioning is welcomed. It is hoped that no student will ever hesitate to ask questions in class. Questions from the students is the only barometer outside of exams by which the professor can measure the degree of understanding the class has attained. My only request is that students retain their dignity at all times and exhibit a high degree of courtesy within the classroom. And so here you do see that intention of a teacher who just doesn't simply communicate knowledge or communicate information or bits of data, but wants the students to understand it, to get it, to attain an understanding. The other paragraph that I love is a little bit earlier in the syllabus. And Dr. Sproul says about his office hours, professor is available for consultation. Then he says also, the professor is always available to spend time with students on a personal basis regarding spiritual or other problems. The student is encountered to feel completely free in making such appointments with the professor. And then he says this, also, I would like to personally invite any student who so wishes to make arrangements to visit me in my home. And then he says, my home telephone number is, and he gives these students his home telephone number. And then he says address, and he gives his address, and he tells them how to get there. So this also reveals that as a teacher, he not only wanted his students to get it, he wanted to be engaged in his students' lives and to see the impact of the teaching on their lives. You know, he would talk about getting theology into your head, right? You got to get theology into your head. But then he wants that theology to get into your heart. And then he wants it to ooze out your fingertips, right? That it's head, heart, and then a transformed life that lives this out. So you see it back in 1967 in the syllabus as a communicator. And of course, we have noted the irony that in his career path, he has left communicator blank, but I think it has something to do with being the kind of teacher he was. You know, Augustine said, great teachers, first and foremost, love God. Then they love their subjects, then they love their students. And you saw that in R.C. as a teacher. Whether he was a teacher in a classroom behind a lectern, or a teacher over the radio, or a teacher through books, you saw that. Well, the last piece of R.C. is, as understanding this theologian as a communicator, is what he said also an apologist. So I have one of his early notebooks that was used for some lecture outlines that he gave in the early years, going back to the 70s, at the Ligonier Valley Study Center. And one of these is the problem of inerrancy. Now, this is a very fascinating little outline that he gives. And he talks about the challenge that is going on currently in the denominations of inerrancy. And when he gets over onto the second page of this, and he starts talking about solutions. So then at the very bottom of the page, he writes, need evangelical summit. And then he puts positions refined, misunderstandings clarified, dialogue, etc. Then he says this, may fail, but must try it. Now, this was right in 1977. This is just as the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy was being started. And the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy is going to come in 1978. So here he is saying, we must have an evangelical summit on this. And then he says, we may fail, but must try it. Well, Chicago Statement was anything but a failure. It was a tremendous success. But I point this out because this is R.C. as an apologist. You know, there's a saying that's often attributed to Luther, and I don't think, we can't quite trace it back to Luther, but it certainly sounds like something Luther would have said. So I have no problem with attributing it to Luther. But Luther said, if you're not willing to defend the gospel at the point at which it's being attacked, then you're not defending the gospel at all. And when you go back into the 1970s, the point at which the gospel was being attacked was at its very foundation of questioning, is this Holy Bible the inerrant Word of God, or isn't it? And so he responded to that attack. Apologists, you know, a theologian knows the faith. And we're all theologians. We're all students of God's Word. We're all students of God. It's one thing to know the faith. It's another thing to defend the faith, and another thing to contend for the faith. And so R.C. was not just a theologian. He was an apologist. And these outlines are from early lectures at the study center. They're all on apologetic themes. So that was the one on inerrancy. The very next one is, does God exist? And he begins walking through the evidences against God, then the evidences for God. Well, after that lecture, here's a topic that's very much of current issue. Is Christ the only way? And here he is dealing with it. Back in the 70s at the study center, he walks through the challenges, you know, what about tolerance? And doesn't this present a mean God, etc.? He walks through all these, has responses. He comes to the end and he says that essentially you need to have this sort of broad vision of God if you're going to challenge that there's more than one way, right? So if Christ is not the only way, then we're not just talking about the doctrine of Christ. This is going to have to push us back now to how we think about God. So here we are, that Reformed theologian. We're always going to circle back to the doctrine of God. And then he says, has God done enough for you? Right? And then he puts one way, right? Is, one way, equal sign, one way is unbelievably gracious. So it's not mean to say God has provided only one way. It's actually the opposite. It's an incredible gracious act of God to provide the way of salvation. But it's very fascinating how he walks through that. And then I was totally intrigued by this last piece here. And he has up on there, Preface to Rational Christianity. And he talks about what is a rational Christianity. Well, this is apologetics. This is what he's talking about. And he presents the case for rational apologetics, and then he goes and talks about what are the three necessary ingredients for this. And the one is the law of non-contradiction. And he develops that. Then the second is the law of causality, and he develops that. And then thirdly, he has a basic reliability of sense perception. Now, if you know Dr. Sproul's books, you know that he never wrote a book, Rational Christianity. What this book emerged as was a book written by help from his mentor, John Gershner, and by another study center teacher, Art Lindsley. So Sproul, Gershner, and Lindsley published the book, Classical Apologetics. The section that R.C. wrote of that book was this book that he didn't write, but incorporated that material into that one, and it's on his Rational Christianity. Now, when he gets to writing that book, he also adds a fourth thing to the law of non-contradiction, law of causality, basic reliability of sense perception. And really, these are the things that are at work for everything that we come to know. And then we apply that to the knowledge of theology and the knowledge of the propositions that feed into the gospel. Well, he adds a fourth thing, analogical language, which he picks up from his friend Thomas Aquinas. I only say that to say, here he is in the 70s, writing out an outline that's going to be a preface for this book that he's thinking about, comes out in this classic text, Classical Apologetics, published in 1984. And we associate Dr. Sproul with this view of apologetics that we call classical apologetics. And then it comes out in his later book, published in 2000, Defending Your Faith, which I always recommend to people. This is the book for Dr. Sproul on apologetics, Defending Your Faith. But here it is. And so he was a theologian, but he was a theologian who was also a communicator. And he knew how to hold an audience. And I think it's because he ultimately cared about that audience. You know, I mentioned this. When you heard him talk, I heard him talk, whether it was in church at St. Andrews or at conferences, you felt like he was talking directly to you. Because I think in one sense, R.C. really was talking directly to you. He was a great communicator, but he was also an apologist. So he knew he not only needed to know the faith, but we also need to defend the faith and contend for the faith. Well, I love wandering over here to our rare book room and wandering through the Sproul Collection. I just gave you a little tip of the iceberg of some of the manuscripts and some of the books that we have that are part of the Sproul Collection. I'd love for you to come and visit us and spend some time in the rare book room yourself with the collections that we have. And hopefully this was helpful for you to get just a little bit of insight into Dr. Sproul and his contribution and his legacy that he has left for all of us. So just want to thank you for this time at our Rare Book Room lecture, and thank all of you that have joined us online and are watching. Thanks for spending this time with us.